Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And I understand we're being streamed as well, so good evening to the people I can't see. Thank you very much for coming along. And tonight's subject is Enigma. So I guess the first thing I'd better say is, well, what's Enigma? And it's this, quite simply. It was a machine that the Germans used during World War II to make sure that their signals were secure. It will take a piece of plain language, turn it into something that makes no sense whatsoever, and then the same machine at the far end will turn it back into plain language. Simple as that. You know, I'm sure you've seen films, read books about the whole story. And what I want to do this evening is give you a bit of sort of background, some context to it, and try and explain why this thing was important, how it worked, why it was so difficult to crack, and how they went about it, and more to the point, what everybody else was doing. And I mean, the whole story is simplified down now, and you'll come across this stuff that says, oh, the fiendish Germans invented this machine, the clever British broke it, and that shortened the war by 18 months. Job done. Of course, no story is that simple. And for a start, at any given time, there were 300 or so different radio networks operating. Each radio network had its own unique setting of Enigma machines. And each of those settings was changed every 24 hours. So you couldn't just crack Enigma and that's it, job done. If you wanted to read every piece of traffic, which never happened, you would have to crack it 300 times every day. Suddenly become a bigger task than the simplified version. Anyway, I'll start going through a little bit of that. But the first thing we've really got to do is sort of calibrate ourselves. We're used to computers and the power of computers, but we've got to take ourselves back to when this stuff was developed, which was the 1920s. And think of the technology they had available then. To me, this summarizes it. People were going to war on horses. It was all basic stuff. And I love that slide because I've always wondered what would happen if he pulled the trigger. It wouldn't be quite so composed. So we'd say we're going back to an era of simple mechanics, and that's when this stuff was developed. Well, for every invention, there has to be a sort of driving force. And the driving force for all this stuff was radio communication. That started to occur First World War. And of course, as soon as you put a message on the airwaves, anybody can intercept it. A little bit different to it going down a telephone line or in a letter or something like that, where interception is quite difficult. As soon as it's there out on the airwaves, anybody can listen to it. And so you've got to try and make it secure. And that's why all these came into being. So how do we go about it all? Well, if we start off with a message, I don't think my laser will actually work on this screen. No, it doesn't do anything at all. So bottom left, we start with a plain language message. We want to send it across some sort of channel, be it radio, something like that, and we want it to be secure. So we use some means to scramble that message. Send it across the channel. At the far end, person at the far end has got the opposite means of descrambling it, and you get your message back again. So all straightforward. If, however, we want to intercept that message, these are the bad guys, we're the good guys, and we can receive that message and we want to try and break it, make sense of it. Well, techniques we might use, if we can steal the code book, then we know how it's coded, we can decode it. That's all very fine as long as the other people don't spot that their code book's been interfered with. If they spot that, of course, they change it, and so that method's lost. We can do a straight mathematical attack on it, look at this coded traffic and try and work out how on earth they got from plain language to code. And one thing that will help us is if we can have what's called a crib. which is being able to match a piece of plain language to a piece of code. So we can then start to think, well, how did they get from that to that? And if we can work that out, we've got a means of decoding it. So there's a few sort of terms that are used in this world, and they get mixed up, but I'll do my best, and I'll probably fall into the trap later on. If we take a message and we change it at the level of the word, so something like the weather tomorrow, the word the becomes another word, weather becomes another word, tomorrow becomes another word, then strictly speaking, that's a code. If, however, we change it at the level of the letter, so T might go to U, H to I, something like that, then strictly speaking, that's a cipher. There's a couple of ways of doing ciphers. And one way is what's called transposition. And that's just another word for an anagram. So you have exactly the same letters as you had in the plain language, but you just have some means of jumbling them up. You might take every 10th letter and so on, and the person at the other end knows to count every 10th letter. That's a transposition cipher. The other one is a substitution, where you change a letter for another letter. So the simplest one, A might go to B, B might go to C, C might go to D. That's actually known as the Caesar cipher, so you can see how far back that goes. I know as kids we used to send messages to each other in class thinking that the teacher couldn't read them. Well, how wrong we were. So who did what? For codes, the first thing you need is a code book. It's a dictionary in essence. So for each word, you look up another word or a series of letters. And here is a code book for coding. Come and have a look at it afterwards. It's just a big dictionary. Of course, you need another code book for decoding. So you can immediately see the problem. This weighs a ton. This isn't one of the naval ones that's got lead covers, which I wouldn't be standing here holding. They're incredibly heavy. So really, they were good for static locations or ships or something like that. Absolutely hopeless if you're a soldier in the field. The last thing you'd want to do is carry two of those around with you. And the risk of compromise, it's almost impossible to destroy. So absolutely no good. So if we're people out in the field, then ciphers are the way to go for us. And the people that started using these, well, Special Operations Executive, they've got people scattered around the place, and the task of sending radio messages back again. And they started off using transposition, ever more complicated to avoid them being decoded, intercepted. Of course, the risk then, the more complicated you make it, the more the risk is that somebody will make an error. And the last thing you need if you're sat under a bush sending a message, knowing that you're being direction found and people will be round very shortly, is an instruction from the other end, garbled, please send it again. So SOE very soon worked out that firstly, this wasn't working for them, and secondly, that the Germans were reading this stuff. They knew how to unscramble it. So that takes you into the world of substitution. You can make things somewhat more complicated. And there's a couple of techniques you can use there. And substitution, of course, clears the way to using machines. Effectively, that's what a machine does. And then there's a thing called a one-time pad that I'll show you a bit later on. There's a page from the Admiralty secret cipher. It's actually a code, but the Admiralty, being the Admiralty, thought the word cipher was a lot posher than the word code, so they called it a cipher. And that's just a page from the dictionary. You looked up the word, it gave you a series of numbers, and then to make sure that you didn't keep repeating the same numbers, so that the wasn't the same set of numbers each time, there was another set of numbers that were changed regularly that you added to them. It's called super encipherment. And that takes us into early machines. The one on the left dates back to the American Civil War. That's very simply a ring of letters on the inside, ring of letters on the outside, and you can move the inner ring round to have different combinations. Well, you think that's a bit Mickey Mouse, and at one point, Kellogg's were giving those away in cornflake packets. But believe it or not, here's one. And this is one that the Germans gave their agents that they were parachuting into Britain. You can have a look at it. Couldn't be simpler, but I think it gives you an idea of how long they expected them to last. A piece of cardboard with some letters on was good enough. Something slightly more sophisticated is this one. And this was invented in the early 1800s by a gentleman by Jefferson. He went on to be a US president. Not entirely sure present-day US presidents are quite up to. I must be careful. But what you did with these, there's a series of discs with the letters of the alphabet on there. And you turn the disc until the message you want read through that window. And then you just sent another line. Doesn't matter, just another set. At the far end, you aligned the letters you'd received and then just looked around for one line that was plain language. Again, pass it around, you can have a little look. Very simple device. And pretty easy to crack, especially if you've got one. But you're getting back to one of the principles in the whole world of codes and ciphers is you match the complexity of the code or cipher you're using to the length of time that you need the piece of information to be secure. So if this was an instruction to advance in 10 minutes, and it's going to take the opposition an hour to sort it out, that's absolutely fine. And believe it or not, these machines, even though they go back to the early 1800s, the Americans were still using these in Vietnam, and they were perfectly okay, for a very short period. So let's go and have a little look at an Enigma. I could spend the whole evening on ciphers other than Enigma, but that's not what you've come from, so Enigma it is. Enigma was invented shortly after the First World War. It was a Dutchman that came up with the concept. He was a good engineer, but not a good marketeer. It was taken over by a German chap who wasn't a good engineer, but was a good marketeer. Everett is thus, and he started marketing them. The initial idea for these machines was that they were going to be used by the banking world, the commercial world, for confidential traffic. Sort of thing we use our Barclay card for now, but the military weren't involved at all, weren't interested at that stage. We're talking late 20s, early 30s. This is an advert for the commercial model in the newspaper in Germany, late 1920s. As well as this machine, they came up with some other variations, but this was the main machine. It sort of settled on this design. And they sold them to all sorts of other countries. And so quite widely available. The so-called Enigma G on the left was sold to Hungary. And each country that bought them could ask for modifications. And Hungary, for instance, they had a little counter in it, so you could tell how many times the key had been pushed, which was quite a useful feature. The Swiss bought a load, and you've got the Swiss K. When you use this machine, you have one operator pushing the buttons and somebody beside him writing down what lights light up. And so they're sort of huddled up together, looking over one another's shoulders. The Swiss clocked this, and so one of the things they did was they asked for a second lamp board on an extension lead, so the two people could sit at a reasonable distance and work more easily. However, the Swiss were deeply suspicious of the Germans, They thought, well, if they've flogged us these machines, they're bound to have some way of reading it as well. So we don't really trust them. So they bought a batch of them. And the first thing they did was took them to pieces, worked out how they work, designed their own, and produced this. This is called the NEMA, and NEMA stands for New Enigma. One of the wise things the Swiss did, they only ever built 750 of those, whereas the Germans built 20,000 of those ultimately. And so they were somewhat more secure. They also worked out some of the failings of this machine and avoided them in that machine. So even though it looks simpler, it's somewhat more secure. And surprise, surprise, there's an advert for Enigma machines. You'll notice it's in English, and that's because it was in the Telegraph in London. And 1930s, if you've got 50 quid to spare, you could buy yourself an Enigma machine. And in fact, the salesman went into the Foreign Office to try and flog them one of these, took it along for them to have a look at. A civil servant wrote the report afterwards, having seen this. And he said, oh, I don't think it's very good, really. And it's terribly expensive. No, it's not for us. Sent the chap away. So an opportunity missed. But the Germans were going to make sure that nobody copied their design. So they patented it in Germany, in the States, and in England. And that's a copy of the patent for the Enigma machine from 1927. Very detailed description of it, which was languishing in the patent office all the way through World War II without anybody knowing it was there. I found it some years ago, but there's all the drawings on the end there as to how the innards work, all the rest of it. So, whoops. But there's the patent. Let's just have a quick look around the world and see what other people were up to, because everybody had got the same problem. We need to make our communications secure. Machines are the way to go. And at a first cut, you'd say, well, every country is developing these in isolation. But the more you study this subject, the more you realize that they've all been peeping over each other's shoulders. And virtually every machine around the world that was being developed at that time it is either a brother or a cousin to Enigma. And it's quite surprising. So let's have a quick peek. I've mentioned the Swiss. There's the NEMA machine on the right, the new Enigma. So we know that relationship. And then over in Sweden, there was a company called Hagelin. It was started up and run by Boris Hagelin. And he responded to an invitation to tender from France for machines. Now, the French had a slightly different idea on this. The invitation to tender they put out specified that the machine must be wholly mechanical, nothing electrical in it. They were thinking of this machine being used out in the field, so they didn't want a battery to go flat and the thing not to work. So wholly mechanical, and it had to fit inside a greatcoat pocket. So that specified the size of it, really. And Boris Hagelin came up with a design, uses a totally different principle to the Enigma machine. There it is on the right, the C35. And I don't know if any of you remember the adding up machines we had years ago, where you ching ching. It's very similar to that. And you can have a play later, but you set a letter on there and even sounds like one of the adding up machines. And there's what's called a basket in there, which is the bit at the back with little metal tabs on there, which engage in cogs at the front, and you can change where the tabs are. That was used all the way through World War II. The Germans used it. The Long Range Desert Group used it. The Americans used it. And so it was appearing all over the place. The Americans adopted it, as you'll see later on, and modified it slightly. But they continued in use after World War II. And Suez Crisis, the Egyptians were using it, and we were reading their traffic, which was quite handy. And um, the, the way it was sorted out, funnily enough, was the clicking noise that makes is fairly unique as to where the tabs are. The cipher room of the Egyptians was bugged. We were listening, and you could listen to the clicks, analyze the clicks, and work out what the machine settings were. Other story. Boris Hagelin also, he got hold of one of the Enigma machines and had a look at it. He could immediately see what the deficiencies were. And so he produced something that was a hybrid of an Enigma machine and his technique. And that's it on the left, the B21. And so it's a sort of bits of each, really. And it bred a whole family of machines that went on for years. And Hagelin post-war moved to Switzerland from Sweden, and Hagelin AG carried on. And even back to first Gulf War, Hagelin machines were in use. And even back then, there were rumors going around the place that the Americans somehow or other had a backdoor into Hagelin machines and were reading the traffic. Quite handy, the Iraqis were using it. Anyway, it's come to light only fairly recently that not only did the Americans have a backdoor into these, they'd bought the company. So when Hagelin moved from Sweden to Switzerland, it was now CIA owned. So they had more than a backdoor, they had the front door as well. Now we come to USSR. Well, they've not changed really. And if you can find a way other than spending money on research, like by nicking the other person's machine, that's the way the Russians will go. And so what the Russians did was phoned up Boris Hagelin and said, here, Boris, you do remember that you come from Russia. You haven't forgotten your mother country. Well, we'd like to tell you that your family are alive and well at the moment. How about a couple of machines? And so Boris handed over a couple of his machines to Russia. They called them the B211. They just put a 1 on the end. They didn't disguise where they got it, and away they went. And Russia continued making ever more complex machines. They incidentally never had an equivalent to Bletchley Park. They didn't need it because they had a spy in Bletchley Park feeding them all the traffic anyway. Chap called Peter Cancross. But you can see some of these complicated machines. This one on the left, the M155, was for coding weather reports. The first that was ever seen of that was one appeared on eBay some years ago. Still wrapped up in polythene. The West had never seen one at this stage. The other one, Fialka, that really is the ultimate in Enigma machines. They worked out all the deficiencies and overcame them all. And it's so incredibly sophisticated. Enigma's got something like 150 million possibilities. The Fialka's got 8 trillion possibilities. So somewhat bigger. The West saw of those was the 6 Days War, Israel versus Egypt. A couple were captured. Quick look at America. And America were very active in World War I in code breaking, and very good at it. At the end of World War I, however, an American senator found out what was going on, and he famously said, "Gentlemen, do not read one another's mail." And the entire code breaking operation was closed down. And it was quite difficult for the Americans to regenerate it because they went one stage further between the wars and made sending traffic in code illegal, which was a pity, really, because a chap called Heben had just started the company to make coding machines, and he promptly went bust. That's a Heben machine on the left. And I assumed that he'd started from scratch, but no, he hadn't. He'd had a peek at an Enigma machine. And then once the Americans started winding the whole operation up again towards World War II, brilliant cryptographer in America, he came up with a thing called SIG-FOI. which again, you can see it looks Enigma-ish, and not surprising because although he never really admitted it, he'd got his hands on an Enigma machine and knew how they worked. And ultimately, the US built something called Cigaba, right? The beast at the top. And if you remember the slide I showed you at the beginning of Enigma variations, well, there's a great likeness to Cigaba. Again, not really surprising because it's one and the same. And then they also used Boris Hagelin's machine at the bottom. Finally, UK. UK used a machine called TypeX. And how this came about, again, you can see the likeness. Between the wars, an RAF officer by the name of Lywood, he bought 2 Enigma machines. Don't know how he funded it, don't ask. But anyway, he bought 2 of these, sent them off to the Creed teleprinter company with a list of things he wanted done to them. And they came back called Enigma with Type 10 modifications. That was truncated to TypeX. That became the British coding machine, which was used up until the 1950s. And then it was replaced by a more complicated machine. Now, one of the interesting things that happened was that 10 of these machines got left behind at Dunkirk and the Germans captured them. And on the face of it, you would think total disaster, this secret British machine now in German hands. But it had completely the opposite effect to that you would have thought. The Germans looked at them and said, oh, it's an Enigma machine. Oh, and it's got a printer on it. That's what the 2 drums are. Oh, that's rather handy. So they modified it back to a standard Enigma and used it themselves. But the conclusion they came to was that because the British were using an Enigma derivative, they must consider them secure. Therefore, they couldn't possibly have broken the German Enigma. So it actually gave them more confidence that their system was secure. And they never actually broke this from scratch anyway, because again, their mindset was, well, it's Enigma, it's unbreakable, isn't it? So they just left it alone. So it so often happens in this world that the outcome is not what you expect. It's completely the opposite. Italians are in the game. There's a bit more Gucci, more chrome on it, makes coffee. And Japan were there as well. That's based on an Enigma machine. And the Germans were always worried about Enigma. They never took it for granted. They were always doing security checks. And they had waiting in the wings another machine, the SG-41, to replace Enigma if ever that became necessary. But by the time they got to that stage in the sort of closing days of the war, then they just didn't have the capability of mass producing these. And so there were only about 30 of these ever made. And if you look at it closely, you can see the basket mechanism at the top. It's Boris Hagelin's design again. So you can see how intertwined everyone is. These are incredibly valuable. If you find one, and hang on to it. Post-war, the machines based on rotors still went for some time. There's a fairly late one. If any of you were in the Navy in 60s, so you probably come across the KL7, beast of a thing. Another one down there, Bid 51. And then sort of late 80s, it all went electronic and hasn't quite got the same interest. Did anybody have one of the sharp programmable calculators? That sort of ring a bell? Yeah, well, the Russians ripped off the design, built their own. They called it the MK85M, but there is a variation called the MK85C, which are incredibly rare, which was actually a cipher machine. But nobody took any notice of it because it looked like a rip-off of a sharp programmable calculator. And so it slid through luggage all over the place without anybody noticing. Now, if anybody gets stuck for a question at the end, then Germans built 20,000 of these, and it's interesting to track what happened post-war, but I'll save that for the end. Let's have a little look at the design of these. I'll read that because it's probably a bit tough from the back. The three rotor machine, that's this one, can generate 156 million different keys. And the key is a unique way of setting up the machine. And if we start putting a sequence of letters in, that sequence won't repeat for 17,500 letters. So you can see that we've got quite a complicated machine. For any mathematicians amongst you, that's 26 cubed. So how did it work? If we take one wheel, this is the heart of an Enigma machine. It has 26 contacts around this side, 26 contacts around this side. So if you think of those letters A to Z, and then you can cross-link them inside. So that's not A to Z around here, that's a jumble of letters. So that one wheel like that has done a very simple substitution. Not in itself secure, but if now, every time we put a letter in, it clicks forward by one, it's now changing the substitution code, and it'll do that 26 times. So you've now got a series of 26 individual codes. So it's a little bit more secure. So if we now go one step further, I can't hold up three wheels, I'll do two. Now, if that clicks 26 times, that now clicks 1, 26, 1. We've got a 26 squared individual codes. And so things getting more secure. We put a third wheel on, and we've got 26 cubed. Pass these around, you can have a look. Quite like these back at the end of the evening, wouldn't I? It's my pension. So far so good. We've got a machine now that is quite secure, but the thing we want is the same machine to code and decode. And as it stands at the moment, if the wire on top left is the input, one on bottom right is the output, if we want to decode with the machine, we've got to swap it around. So the one on the bottom right becomes the input, that one becomes the output. Now you could do this by some complicated switching. So that you switch all the outputs to the inputs. But this is where the designer of this thing came up with a really novel idea. And what he did was put in a thing called the reflector. And so you go in at the top, all the way through, into the reflector, which is wired back on itself, all the way through and back out again. So if you imagine a path that goes all the way through and out here, then all the way through goes out here. It's what's called reciprocal. So if that's code, or if that's plain language, that's code. Then if that's code, that's plain language. There's no switching involved. But it does have a weakness. It means that no letter can be coded to itself because it can't come out on the pin that it went in on. So A cannot ever be coded as A. And that piece of knowledge is really valuable when you're trying to crack this machine. The Russians realized that, and they overcame it in the Fialka. It doesn't have that weakness. So there you can see the three rotors at the back. And go back one. Keyboard at the front, so you push a key and one of those bulbs lights up. And the one thing you know is that if you push key A, it won't be A that lights up, it's another one. And you can try it on the Enigma machine that's got a battery on it. And then just to make it a bit more complicated, they put a plug board on the front here so that you can add another layer of encipherment on the top. So if without the plugs in, A had become Z, you can now cross-patch Z to another letter. So it's another layer on top. And then just for a little bit more fun, you've got three rotors in the machine, and each day they're changed, and those 3 are selected from a selection of 5 for an Army or an Air Force machine, or 8 from a naval machine. And there's a setting sheet each day that tells you where to put them.
Alan, is the connection of the wires inside the cog, is that just kept the same, or is that changed every day?
The question was, is the connections inside the cog the same, or is that changed? Straight answer is, for a given cog, it's the same, it's not changed. But if you look on the ones that are going around, you'll see there's a little digit down there, and that's anything between 1 and 5. All cog 1s are wired the same, all cog 2s are wired the same, and so on. A little bit later on, right at the end of the war, the Germans did come up with a reflector which could be altered and plug wired, but it never really went into mass use. Whilst we're on that theme, there's a rotor set from the Russian machine, and Typex was the same. You had a centerpiece which was called a biscuit, and you could take the biscuit out and rotate that and put it in. So that had the same effect as changing the wiring. But Enigma couldn't do that. So how did we use the thing? Well, this is one of the sort of first examples where the hardware and the software were separated. And one of the reasons behind that was the Germans assumed that the machines would get captured. It was inevitable. But unless you captured the setting sheet, the machine was no good to you. So what you had was a daily setting sheet that was issued for a month at a time. And that told you how to set up your machine for the day. There's a copy up there. It told you which rotors to put in, what the order of the rotors was, what the initial setting position was, and which of these plugs to put in. And so any given radio net would be set up the same. And there's another copy of a setting sheet. And I realize you won't be able to read that from there, but it starts at the first of the month at the bottom and goes on up. And that may seem odd, but the reason behind that is that after you've used the first of the month, you tear it off and burn it. So even if that sheet is captured on the second of the month, you can't read yesterday's traffic. So that will gradually disappear as the month goes on. The security feature they put in, which again, in all these things, it can backfire on you. They said that a given rotor must not be in the same position for 2 consecutive days, and the same rotor order must not be used again in the month. But of course, as soon as you do that, from our point of view, that was reducing the possibilities that you had to look at. Because if you knew for days 1 to 5 what the rotor order was, you know that those aren't going to be used again. And so as the month goes on, it becomes easier. So here we are setting up the machine. We take the 3 rotors, put them on the spindle, put them in the machine, set up our plug board, set our 3 wheels to a start position. Chap at the other end's done exactly the same. Now, if we went ahead and just coded our traffic now, in effect, we'd all be using the first little segment of the cipher stream. Or putting it another way is, if we repeated the message and recoded it, it would be exactly the same. And that's a weakness. It's called a depth, and we don't want that. So there's an element of random put in. And what has to happen is that I come up with, as the operator, I set my machine at the day's settings, chap at the other end does, and the first thing I do is think of 3 letters at random. Now, being a lazy sort of soul, I'd come up with my initials, ADW. And the idea is I key in ADW twice, ADW, ADW, and note down what the machine tells me. And that becomes the first part of the message that goes. You can see it's SOR-SKH. It's called the indicator. And then I set my wheels to ADW rather than the day's setting, code my message, send it off. Chap at the other end, the first thing he does is put in SOR, SKH, and he'll come up with ADW, ADW. He sets his wheels to ADW, can decode the message. And the idea really is that the next message I send, I won't use ADW, I'll use something else. Of course, being lazy, I won't. And you can see a machine in operation there. Right down the bottom, there's the machine, there's a cipher clock. Two of them, one pushing the buttons, one writing it down, radio operator beside. This isn't connected to the radio set in any way, shape, or form. It's purely passing the stuff across. It's referred to as an offline machine. So let's have a little look at breaking it. I'll read this out to you. Now, I guess in our working lives, we've all written this sort of report. From a mathematical standpoint, we cannot speak of a theoretically absolute unsolvability of a cryptogram, but due to the special procedures performed by the Enigma machine, the solvability is so far removed from practical possibility that the cipher system of the machine, when the distribution of keys is correctly handled, must be regarded as virtually incapable of solution. Or putting it another way, I think it's all right, Golf, but if it isn't, don't blame me. Now, the Germans were always looking at the machines and trying to work out if there were vulnerabilities or if there was any possibility or if any event could be put down to a machine being cracked. But it got to the point where it really wasn't a sensible thing to say, I think there's something wrong with these machines, because you suddenly became very unpopular, and the next thing you knew, you were on the Russian front. So the sensible thing to do was come up with something like that and say, yeah, I think it's all right, really. In terms of breaking it, knowing what the possibilities are, if we gave every man, woman, and child an Enigma machine, that's in the British Isles, they would have to try 3 million possibilities on each starting position, on each wheel order, and would work their whole life to break one key. And that just gives you an idea that with the technology of the day, then doing what's called a brute force attack, which is start at option 1, no, that doesn't work. Look at option 2, no, that doesn't work. You're going to be there a very, very long time. It's not going to work. So the only way of breaking Enigma really was finding ways in, finding out what the errors were, finding shortcuts. And I'll give you an idea of those. Little example of finding shortcuts. That is a simple substitution. Who's going to get there first?
Quick round fox.
Quick round fox. Well done. Thank you. How did you get there, JJ?
I don't know what signals at one stage.
Ah, right. Okay. I thought you were going to say you've been to one of these before, but no. It's looking at patterns. UIF is repeated. Well, what's the most common sequence of 3 letters in the British language? It's the. So there's a clue. The next thing you'll spot is that there's virtually no repeat of any letter. And the quick brown fox was used in teleprinter days to test the teleprinter because it tested every key. It's sort of the shortest phrase that will do that. So there it is. But you got there by looking at patterns. You didn't get there by saying, well, what are the mathematical possibilities? Because if you look at the mathematical possibilities, to do a simple substitution, let's say A goes to another letter. So A, I've now got 25 possibilities. When it comes to looking at B, I've now got 24 possibilities. So the number of ways I can just put that simple substitution together are 25 by 24 by 23 by 22, 25 factorial, which is a huge number. It's 4 with 26 noughts after it. And if I told you there was 4 with 26 noughts after it, possibilities, when I showed you that, you'd say, well, that's not worth bothering. And yet in seconds, somebody spotted the answer. And that really is the basis of cryptography. We'll forget that one. And this is a page out of an American manual. There's a little bit of plain text across the top. And what's been done is to count how many times each letter has appeared in that bit of plain text. And you can see the pattern that's formed there. That first peak is E, not surprisingly. If we take that same piece of plain text and do a transposition cipher on it, i.e. jumble it up, an anagram, look at the pattern, it's the same. And that pattern is sort of unique to any language. So you took any piece of English text and you'll get that pattern out of it. So we can immediately see if a piece of coded text is an anagram. And third one down, it's a substitution. And you can immediately see from that that E has gone to W, because that's where the peak has gone. And that letter frequency analysis totally blew away simple systems. And when you apply that to something coded in Enigma at the bottom there, you can see you're getting near random. So it doesn't lend itself to that sort of analysis. Just briefly, the one-time pad. That's a very simple technique, but it is completely secure to this day. It doesn't matter how much computing power you've got, you cannot crack a one-time pad. The one-time pad works by having a pad of random numbers and only ever having 2 copies of that. You'd have one, I'd have one. And if I wanted to send you a message, I'd take the plain text, I've got the word secret there, just under it I put where it appears in the alphabet. S is the 19th letter. Look at a sequence of numbers from my one-time pad, subtract one from the other without putting the carry in. Far n, person will receive the sequence of numbers. You look at his one-time pad and add without carry, and then he'll get the original back again. And once that's done, we both destroy that sheet of our pad. And that now is uncrackable. The Russians used that all the way through World War II and afterwards. The British used it as well for specific traffic. Both the British and the Americans were listening to the Russian stuff, but couldn't make any sense of it, but recorded it, kept it. And some years later, it was spotted that the Russians must have had duplicates of the one-time pads, which is a huge no-no, and they'd started using them. And so all of a sudden, it became possible to get into this stuff. That's a lecture in its own right, but if you put into Google the word Venona, V-E-N-O-N-A, that was the project to decode this stuff. And you'll read the official version of how Philby was found out, for instance. Well, it's not true. He was found out by Venona Decrypt. All sorts of stuff came to light from that. It's still in use. If anybody here listens on the shortwave, you'll occasionally hear what are called number stations. Sounds like somebody just reading out strings of numbers. Well, that's a communication going out to an agent in the field, one-time pad. Okay, cracking Enigma. The first bit was done by the Poles, and really the British wouldn't have got there without Polish help. And what the Poles did was they spotted this indicator, the SOR-SKH. They knew that must be 3 letters, the same repeated. And this is the gentleman that was behind it, Vareski. And what he did was looked at all the indicators from all the traffic on one network one day. And he realized that there were patterns formed in that. Now, it take me ages to go through this in detail, but there's the pattern, for instance. Halfway down the left-hand side where it starts L, goes to T, then T goes to K, and then come around K goes to G, and so on. And you can follow that round. And what he found was that the pattern you got depended upon the wheel order and the position of the wheels. And with a basic machine, 3 rotors in there, there were 100,000 possibilities, and the Poles went through and catalogued the whole lot. So if they got enough traffic from a given network in the day, they could look at the pattern and then look up in their book and say, oh yeah, it's that wheel order. It looked right into the heart of the machine. If you've got the wheel order, it's very simple then to work that backwards. That's how the Poles got there. And they even built a little machine to help them on their way. Now, the Germans were never content. They kept sort of upping the complexity. They went from 3 rotors to 5. The naval side went to 8 rotors, and they realized that this 6-letter indicator was a weakness, and they came out with a new indicator system. And so by the time the British really started getting into trying to crack Enigma, you couldn't do it from the indicator. You had to start looking into the body of the message. And the way that went about, well, we're back to pinches, the occasions when we could get our hands on some of this coding information, a crib where we knew what the format of the message was and a pretty good idea of what the plain language was, or a thing that happened called gardening. And there's many an RAF officer that wondered why on earth they were told to go and shoot up a lighthouse or sink a navigation buoy. And it was quite simply so that the Germans would send out a navigation warning. We knew what the content was because it was our fault. And so that immediately gave you a crib that Lighthouse X extinguished. And then you knew what the Enigma message would be. And probably one of the most famous pinches that happened was U110. It was the British, not the Americans. Don't believe the film. 110 was brought to the surface. Young lieutenant called David Baum, a radio operator and an AB, went across and gathered as much as they could. David Baum was going through the papers in the captain's cabin. The radio office is immediately opposite. And the telegraphist he had brought with him said, "Sir, there's something very strange about this typewriter." Of course, they knew nothing of Enigma, so they unbolted it and took it with them. As it happens, it was the documents that were more valuable. And one of the differences between British attempts at very successful attempts at cracking Enigma traffic and using it was, in effect, it was a factory. It was a huge process involving thousands of people. The Germans, on the other hand, they were no fools at cracking traffic. They were very successful, but they had 10 different groups doing it, some of which were spying on each other. They didn't trust each other, and they didn't have the mechanism to make use of the information they'd got. So although they got a lot of stuff, they weren't nearly successful in using it. So the starting point for the British is the intercept operators. And no lecture on this would be complete without mentioning Alan Turing. His huge contribution to this was that he had thought through what computers were all about, what they'd do, and even written programs for them while they were still a concept. And he concluded that if this was coded by machine, then it should be broken by machine. It was the only way of doing it. And he and the contribution from Gordon Welchman came up with a thing called the Bombi. And in effect, that's 3 motorized Enigmas, and that's trundling through possibilities. And the way it goes about it is, if you've got a piece of coded text at the top that we're intercepted, and we think that the plain language somewhere is Anne Robinson. I don't know why I've come up with that. The X is a break between words. And if you shift that to the left and the right, then knowing that no letter can code to itself, you can get a unique position for it. I wander around here for a moment. You can see that looking down here, no letter has coded it to itself. If I shift it 2 places to the right, O would go to O. A few more places to the right, A would go to A. So I can discount possibilities. So if I can match that piece of plain language, bearing in mind that most military traffic is formatted, if I can match that to a piece of ciphertext, then the thing I can tell the Bombi to do is go and look for a sequence where N goes to A, L goes to N, P goes at successive positions. If any of you did basic programming, it's an if-then statement. If that goes to that, 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 then stop. And if the machine finds a successful match, it will stop. The operator can then read that off, check that it's a good stop, because you can get false ones. And that has then told you what the settings for the machine are. It didn't do the decode, it told you what the settings were. So there's some of the machines. And I did one of these talks at one point, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, can I have a close look at that picture, please? He went and looked, and he said, that's my mum. And she had never told him what she'd done. And there's the checking machine. If you've got a good stop, you could do a check on that to make sure that it was a good stop. And if you go to Bletchley Park, they've rebuilt a Bombay, and it's just glorious. There's an original. Look at that. It's engineer's porn. It's wonderful. And now we know what the machine settings are, then we can decode this traffic. And you would immediately think, well, how are we going to do the decode? Well, we use an Enigma machine. Of course we would. That's what it was coded on. But if you look closely in those pictures, all those ladies are using Type X machines. Because the Type X was just Enigma by another name, and you could very easily reprogram your Type X to be a standard Enigma. So that's what was used. Then you translate it into English. And this is all ladies, German speakers, busily doing that. And then you've got this wealth of information. And the question is, well, what do we do with it? And here you've got a problem. If you do nothing with it, well, what's the point in all this? If you overuse it, then you're going to blow it, and you've lost it anyway. So there were huge rules put in place as to how this information could be used. The first rule was if you took a piece of ciphertext back to plain language, you had so many groups of characters, you could not send a message out with the same number of groups. Because the opposition, if they sent a 400 group message, and then the next day they saw the Brits send out a 400 group message, they'd smell a rat. So everything had to be paraphrased, changed, so that the group numbers were different. It was sent from Bletchley Park to the senior people in the field using one-time pads. And there were special groups that did this, so the link was secure. Out in the field, there was always the risk of the headquarters being overrun. So this stuff would come in one-time pad. It was decoded, taken to the general. He was allowed to read it, not retain it, taken away, taken straight back to the coding office and burnt. So even if they were overrun, there was no evidence there as to what was going on. Very, very clever. And there were some mistakes. And at one point, the Germans had 6 submarines dotted across the Atlantic, the south, sort of roughly along the equator, which were there to resupply submarines at sea. They were bigger ones, they've got extra food, fuel, torpedoes, that sort of thing on there. Through Enigma, then knew where they were. Well, here's the dilemma. How many of those do you sink? And so after a lot of agonizing, they thought 4 out of 6 will do. So they went and sunk 4 out of the 6. And of course, the Americans happened on number 5 just by chance and sunk that. And the Germans were all over it, but they managed to blame the French, so that was okay. Picture bottom left, incidentally, if you look at the wartime maps of Libya, you'll find there's a big red circle on one part of the desert that says, on no account must anybody enter this circle. And that was quite simply because there was a German lookout station in the middle of it. And it was essential that he sent a message at 9 o'clock every morning saying nothing observed. And that was the crib for that network for the day. He was either a lucky man or a very bored man, or both. But that was his war. He sent nothing observed at 9 o'clock every morning. Right. Answer to my previous question. 1945, war's won, and at Bletchley Park, there's something like 10,000 people by this time. They're all assembled. They're told, everything you've done is secret. You must never speak of it. It's all over. It's all going to be destroyed. This is the end of the game. And they saw machines being smashed up. They saw paperwork being burnt. And they went home, firstly, thinking they must never speak of it. And secondly, believing that was it, the end of the war, and all this operation had finished. Of course, the Brits being Brits, the good stuff had already gone out of the back door. A couple of the bombing machines, two of the Colossus, they went first to Eastcote and then to Cheltenham. Why did we still want this stuff? Well, quite simply because we collected in Enigma machines. If you handed in an Enigma machine, you got a weekend pass. They were really quite valuable. And the British refurbished these, gave them to friendly nations, whilst keeping the fact that we'd cracked it secret. And they were given to friendly nations and told, here are spoils of war, totally secure communications medium, where you go. And continue to read all that traffic. And that carried on until the early 1970s, at which point the last country did away with Enigma, and 1976, the secret started to leak out. And of course, the rest, as they say, is history. But there were quite a few people fairly cheesed off about this, and it's not really surprising the Brits aren't trusted. The Russians, they continued using Fialka up until 1995, believed it was secure, but the Americans had cracked it long time since. So there we are, a very quick romp through. You can imagine I could spend a day doing this, and you wouldn't last it. So